Life sometimes come at you fast. Tragedies make your life unravel. You feel like you wanna give up and stay knocked down. Even when your heart is shattered, you still got a life to live. You still got a life to live, so don't give up. We are beautiful miracles. We are beautiful miracles. We are beautiful miracles, so don't give up.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me today on my podcast, Beautiful Tragedy. If you like what you're hearing, would you please like, comment, share, and subscribe? And today it is my great honor to be joined by Meghan Riordan Jarvis. You may recognize her actually from my first episode. She has her own podcast, Grief is My Side Hustle, and I like to call her my podcast mom/mentor because I've learned from you and I've watched your podcast grow, and it's just been so beautiful. So thank you for joining me, first of all.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be back.
Thank you. And I was hoping that since we didn't really hear your story last time, if you would kind of share a little bit about your story and your background and just kind of how it all came to be.
Yeah, thank you. So we just said a second ago, what's the nutshell? So I am a grief and loss informed trauma therapist in Washington, D.C. And I have been in practice as a therapist for like close to 20 years. This has been my bread and butter. And in trauma, we do a lot of grief and loss, but lots of trauma therapists also do lots of other things, like people who've been assaulted. There's some there's some movement in the field about how we define trauma. It used to be called big T and little t, and now people are sort of flexing on what the right words are. And what I would say is there's sort of single event traumas like being in an earthquake or car accident. And then there are traumas that are more like over time developmental traumas, things that take a little while to unfold. And that's like poverty or sexual abuse or anyway, in my life, I had a death when I was 8 years old that I would say left me with unresolved trauma around death and loss. A teenager who was close to my family died while we were at the beach. And my parents were really young and nobody knew what to do. And it was the, mid 80s when we didn't talk to kids about feelings. And it really left this indelible imprint. It stuns me sometimes how permanent the imprint was, not so much around the death, but the meaning that I made from the death, the way that anxiety developed and fear developed. And now, and I know we're going to talk about this today, sort of, I understand the way in which my brain formulated pathways around how I made meaning. So fast forward to, a lot of my interest in becoming a healer probably was, the body and the mind's desire to heal yourself. Right. So I studied, went to school, saw lots and lots of clients and patients, studying trauma the whole way. In 2017, my dad was diagnosed with and died from small cell cancer. And it was a rapid, decline. That's a really aggressive, brutal cancer. He had just turned 80. And in a lot of ways, it was very sad, but it wasn't traumatizing. I knew he was dying. He knew he was dying. We spent a year together. We said goodbye. So there are elements to it that have some of that like trauma where you close your eyes and you see the picture or you can hear something and be triggered. But for the most part, it really was, a very sad event that is probably developmentally normal. And right. I used some resources, but was able to recover. In 2019, I was on vacation with my mom at her house, and she died suddenly in her sleep. And it was after a brief illness. And that did not go down the same way.
So that was totally unexpected for you.
Totally unexpected. We could spend a whole week talking about this, because I think what I would say is when I look back at how I felt and the cues that I was taking in, I understood to some degree that this illness that she had was very serious, and that we as a collective were not taking it seriously, or we were not attending to it with as much attention as it needed. but I didn't consciously know she was dying. I don't believe she consciously knew she was dying. And certainly, she seemed to have a very serious stomach bug. I don't think anyone expected her to die from that. So, and the consequence of learning of her death and all of that was, really hard and triggering. And it is, I do a lot of trauma stories with therapists and who've been through their own trauma and clients. Everybody has this is how I was told, this is how I learned, this is what happened, the before and after. So the immediate after was okay. There's a funeral there, you have to function. My body did all the things that the body does, gave me enough adrenaline and enough focus. Just as I was leaving their home, which is on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, which had this like very deep, profound secondary loss of, I knew that we would not own this home for much longer. It turned out to be longer than I expected, but it was not much longer. So it was like, I'm losing king, queen, and country, all in one fell swoop. And ultimately what happened was I ended up in an inpatient facility because I had such bad PTSD that I could not manage the symptoms without really intensive treatment. And I was lucky enough to be a trauma therapist who sends people to inpatient treatment. We have this phrase where we call it next level of treatment, which is if a weekly or biweekly meeting in my office is not helping to, put the symptoms, relegate the symptoms to the background, then this is how so I knew as I was getting sick, what needed to happen. I really relied on a colleague to sort of shake me straight. And so I went inpatient. I came out and I was like, whoa, this is the world of grief and loss. Right. So I think there's, the analogy that I use a lot is like, you can watch movies about France and you can go to a French restaurant in the United States and you can, spend all your time on your websites about France. But when you go to France, that's France. So when I came out, I had a very different perspective on grief and loss and sort of how we house it in our body. And I did what I do about everything. So, that this would be true if you wanted me to buy a lawnmower. I did a lot of research and I read 88 books in like 3 months that were all on grief and loss. Some were academic textbooks because that's my background. Some were memoirs, and I threw like all but 3 across the room, not because they were terrible books. I'm in the middle of writing a book. It's really, really hard. I just was looking for myself in the story. And a lot of what I found, which again is so worthwhile, but wasn't what I needed in that moment, is just sort of like, this is the story of what happened to me. And this is what the story that happened to you, Meghan. And let me tell you why.
Right.
So the neuroscience, which, I have a light dusting background because we do actually teach people a lot about the physicality of their body and the integration of, you're using your body as a filter to make meaning. But in the 2 years since my mom died, I've taken, I had already taken a lot of, I studied with Bessel van der Kolk, like sensory motor therapy. I'd done a lot of that. But the actual knowing that the hippocampus is, the part of the brain that stores memory and creates memory and how it does that and why it misfunctions, that has been sort of my soapbox ever since. Yeah. And what I love about that work is I don't even need to say the word hippocampus. Like nobody cares what it is. I can go into a class of 5th graders and say, there's this crazy thing that happens to your brain when something really, really bad happens. A little balloon inflates and it cuts off the ability to send signals to the rest of your brain and your memories get all screwed up. And what I can tell you, and this, because this is part of how we got connected, is it is such a freaking relief to people who are really suffering. Yes. It is such a relief for them to hear that. You know what? Yeah, this is like you have a broken leg because you fell down the stairs. It's broken. It's such a relief to have that named. And it's just education. Right. And the secondary piece, which I feel like God love the grief and loss memoirs, God love the grief workbooks. there are things you need to do to get your brain back to straight.
Yeah.
And that we also, one day I'm going to meet Oprah and she's been like, I heard you've been talking a lot of shit about me, but Oprah always has like in her magazine, like, are you stressed out? Like, do these things if you're stressed out. And what I always think when I see those, again, sorry, Oprah, I haven't even read your magazine recently, but in magazines, there will be if you're feeling stressed out, take a bubble bath, go for a walk, do some meditation, write a letter, but no explanation as to which kind of stress do you have. Are you totally depressed in stress? So that's where I've been is sort of having these conversations, and the most exciting are the ones I have with small groups of people who have just, never heard of anything before, never been to therapy before, and they just cannot believe the sort of handhold you're giving them at an incredibly impossible time.
I mean, I have experienced so much with my own brain that it took me a long time to realize it, but there would be times where it's like my brain, I think I tried to describe this to you one time. It's like, I feel like my brain is like dehydrated.
Yeah.
Like, it's like there's just not enough lubrication in there to make everything work right. And it's like, I get to a point where I have to almost like shut off a lot of extra sound. I get very overstimulated, and I already have the disorder of misophonia. You know about misophonia, right?
Yes. You can't handle when people eat noisily.
Yes. And it's like the rage inside,
I understand. It's a real thing for listeners. We're not just saying like, oh, it's annoying when people eat. It's like an actual, like anosmia means you can't smell. Misophonia means that like you are driven inside your body to a state of panic.
Yes.
And like wild irritation, like someone's attacking you when your child crunches their potato chips.
It's actually terrible. When I was younger, I swore there was a microphone in my dad's ear and the speaker was in my ear. But then I took the 23andMe, and that's actually how I found out that I actually have it.
Oh my gosh.
It's on my 23andMe. Isn't that crazy? But on a side note, I just really, I've learned so much from you and from like the writing group and stuff that I've done with you that, actually what I'm experiencing is normal. And I feel like, we get so confused. We don't know what this is. And so sometimes if we can put a label on it, we can understand and, that these symptoms can last a long time. And that's totally normal, because
much longer. Yeah. So where we're really at a deficit, and then I hope we're gonna make a big effort. And, my husband this morning was like, what are you going to do today? And I was like, well, I have 16 branches of my tree that I'm trying to grow today. Because I have various ways that I feel compelled to sort of get this message out. And I'm grateful to be on your podcast, but I really lose sleep over the number of people who are being handed like a giant watermelon of grief to carry with just no teachings of any kind. What they've gotten is a passive, children in particular, what they've gotten is sort of like what they saw out of the corner of their eye, because most of what we do is like, ooh, let's look away from that. And I find that just so like insulting.
Yeah.
Particularly for children. Again, like I've written a curriculum that's for college level, and I was on a podcast and somebody said to me like, well, what about the small children? And I was like, give me the curriculum. I can talk you through this like you're a child in 10 seconds. What I am offering is not that hard. And I think, I don't know, I'm not really like in a world where I'm training with other trauma therapists. The trauma therapists are super interesting people. And to become trauma trained is a little bit like the Navy SEAL thing. I'm not trying to like aggrandize myself, but in order to do the kind of work that a trauma therapist does, you end up training in these really intensive body-centered. And by that, I mean, we're not asking you to come in and talk about your feelings. We're asking you to come in and receive a treatment. So you're going to talk, but it looks more like a dance session or like, I don't know, like maybe we're doing an eye exam because we're using physical tools to interrupt the energy in your body. And what that means is we've spent, I don't know, $100,000 getting trained, and we've done all the work ourselves because you can't do it without using your own body to learn how to do it. So I think people who are trauma therapists are generally off saving the people who have the trauma. And one of the interesting blessings, good things that has come out of my mom's death is that I couldn't go straight back to work. And so I had all this time to sort of think about, like, death is a trauma. People talk a lot about death, but we're not really, like, weirdly, I'm sure there are people out there that are doing this, but honestly, I haven't found them. I found one episode, but I haven't really found people who are like, no, this is my jam. Right. Talking in a psychoeducational way to people who are saying, I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't remember anything. I've had no sex drive for whatever period of time. I mean, one of the things that hurts the most to me, and I had to stop doing it, is I'm a member of several different grief and loss boards, big boards, lots of people. Every single day, there's someone who says, does anyone know why my memory doesn't work right? It's been 2 years and I still can't X, Y, and Z. I can't sit and answer that question to every person, but it kills me every time. Because in my mind, my 10-year-old could tell you. My 10-year-old would come up and say, well, in a trauma, there's this small part of your brain that's wired to keep you alive. And it sends terrible signals, really messes with the signals to your brain. It codes some information in like hard, fine line pen, and others, it doesn't code really at all. Mm. And what's interesting for people who, one of the things that people will talk about is they can't remember their mother's voice. They don't remember their last day with their child. And again, there's wisdom in what the body chooses to do in terms of pack those memories away. But what a neuroscientist will tell you is just work. Use words, write. And those memories will come back. Mm. And I can tell you from my own experience, my memoir that's due on Friday, the one chapter I couldn't write was the one that I was like, this is the hottest one. I know it. And I just couldn't find the details. And I did the writing of every other page of the book. And I woke up one morning and all the memories were there. Mm. And I think that's the neuroscience. And I also think it's the grief work, right. The showing yourself that you can be safe with all those big feelings.
Right. I know that one of the things that our therapist tells us is that, we have to learn how to grieve the loss of our child. And it's hard work, and not everybody wants to do it. And I don't fault anybody for not wanting to do it. But I'm definitely personally in a healing time myself, and I have found that writing and sharing about Jackson and doing things to honor him has helped him. And I didn't really set out to do any of that. Yeah. And so it's just been really a beautiful journey in that. And I don't think I'm anywhere, I'm not healed or anything like that. I'll always carry this grief with me, but I'm learning how to carry my grief and have joy at the same time. And, even I see pictures of myself and, I still don't look quite like myself because I just feel that there's just an inner sadness that I will probably always carry. But, doing the work has gotten me to a point where I feel like I can hopefully say something to someone that might help them. I only have a degree in psychology. I don't have all the specialties like you have. But I could see myself eventually doing that, and hearing you talk about your experience doing grief and loss, and then experiencing your own grief and loss, and then what you can offer to your clients is really priceless, because if I'm going to a grief therapist who's never lost a child, like, they can tell me a lot of things, but they can't explain the experience quite like someone who has had that loss.
What I think about often is you are an expert in grief and loss, 100%. There is no more concrete expertise needed than your own experience. Yeah. To become an educator in grief and loss, you kind of have to understand some stuff. Right. So where my stuff comes in is just like, I became educated in it the way somebody would become educated in like how to change the oil of a car. It doesn't mean that you can't understand it or care about it, but actually to teach somebody about it, you just have to have sort of that background. So that's the distinction. You are absolutely a grief and loss expert and a grief and loss educator, because you're bringing people to your platform to share the pieces of information. And that is, I think, grief work, right? Which is wanting to be able to better the world and help people understand that the experience that you had, which is inventing the wheel for yourself, isn't the way it should have to be. And what I want to say is everybody has to grow their own way forward. I cannot tell you what to do. You cannot tell me what to do. But there are some basic things that we can talk about that are common and true. And I do think there are a bunch of books out there that do that say, this is the experience. And other people are like, yep, I had that exact experience. So there's the like normalizing and then the coaching, right? Like most people who are coached by people, the basketball players and the golf, like they're better than their coaches at it. They're more of but their coaches are good at coaching. And so that's what I think about, when you go to see a therapist, maybe they haven't had child loss, but they are well informed about grief and loss. Part of what they're going to be doing is handing you tools that they believe and have heard and know work. Right.
So can you talk about what some of the treatments are that you as a trauma-informed therapist do?
Yeah. So do you mind if I give like just a quick little background on what the brain stuff is so that you can see how
it.
Okay.
You know it.
Okay. So here's I'm going to give my 7th grade version. I've learned to not do more science than people care about, but essentially the instincts that everybody knows about: fight, flight, and freeze. There's also one called fawn, which means befriending. Those instincts work like this. First, we do the Mr. Rogers strategic befriending. We look around and we say, is there anybody here that can help me with this situation? When we're talking about death, the answer mostly is no. No one is going to help me with the fact that this person in front of me is dead. Your body has a reaction. It goes from, can anyone help me? To then, am I going to run away or am I going to fight against it? No fighting against it. You can run. People have told the story, and maybe the fighting looks like screaming and, kicking and whatever. What happens to a lot of people when there's mortal peril is freeze. And freeze is where trauma can come in. Freeze is where you can kind of get stuck. And then we have these feelings and thoughts that happen when you get out of the freeze. And I mean paralyzation, like, oh my God, I couldn't say anything. I couldn't talk. I couldn't. And that's what happens to a lot of people particularly with sudden loss. Excuse me. Then when the reactive states sort of calm down, we have all these thoughts and feelings about what happened. And what can happen with those thoughts and feelings if we don't help you with them is like the image that I always have, because I grew up at the beach, is like my dad wanted to move the beach path from here to here, so that the grass would grow where it hadn't been. And then we had to walk 1,000,000 times down this one little space so that the hollows of our feet created a path. If you allow thoughts like the one I had when my mom died, it's your fault she died. If you allow them access to the beach, they will run up and down that little path and they will make it permanent. They will kill the grass and they will make it permanent. So what we're doing with our best interventions is we are trying to destabilize that pathway, that neuro pathway that sets in. Because in very real language, we create everything that we know based on what we've already experienced. That's how the human mind works. I know what this iced coffee is going to taste like because I've had iced coffee before.
It's so good.
What's actually, yes, delicious. Our favorite. That's actually in honor of you that I'm drinking iced coffee. Not true. I drink a coffee like every 12 minutes. But when we know what something is based on what it is, what it was for us before, we're in trouble when it comes to novel experiences like grief, because we don't know. We have never experienced this before. The analogy, I probably used it with you before. I remember the very first time I ever tasted lemongrass. I was with a friend. I was in England. We went and got Thai food. I put it in my mouth and I was like, my tongue is telling me I have never had this before. But that's a one-time experience, because then I've tasted it. I'm going to taste it again. So with what happens with trauma, with the loss, with what's happening in the body, is your body is getting this whole series of messages. We have a nerve that goes from the base of our bum to the very tip of our forehead, which is called the vagus nerve. And it sends messages. It sends messages across the brain, but it sends messages. It's a superhighway up and down. And that's how our psychology, our feelings can end up making our bodies sick, because the messaging becomes really problematic. You've actually already survived the trauma, right? 1 second after Jackson stopped breathing, you survived the trauma of his death. It's what meaning am I now going to go and make in my world based on all the ways that I feel? And all those ways that you feel are exactly how the body should feel, because it is trying to regulate itself. So the interventions are body-centered regulations. It doesn't mean we don't talk about how it feels. Writing is a gorgeous way. Support groups are a gorgeous way. But, and this comes up a lot, sometimes support groups where people get together every Thursday at 9 and talk about how awful it was to lose their child become circular pathways of feeling. And if you have someone in that support group who perhaps has other unprocessed trauma, as you are trying to grow forward, that person maybe is not able to grow forward because they need these interventions I'm going to talk about to get the energy moving. And now you're in that group and you're feeling energy and you're moving forward. And I don't mean you're putting the pain behind. I mean, you are literally learning to carry the loss and have a life. Your muscles are just getting bigger. You are still living. This person is walking in a circle, not because they want to, but because that's what's happening. There are some things that happen in support groups. People get mad. They try to take each other down. They do the competitive Olympics. I mean, it can get dirty, right? Particularly ones that don't have a therapist to sort of help intervene. And it really does impact, if you knew someone who was traumatically impacted and they're grieving, it is a little scary to look at people who are, maybe just the average griever, not that their grief is average, but they are not traumatized. They're going to learn to carry it. It's hard to take a look at that and not be a little bit afraid of like, well, when my cousin died, his wife didn't leave the house for the next 19 years. That is not the average story. And her reaction to life is not the average story. So what we do in those instances where people are suffering, and what I'll say to your listeners is suffering is what I go by. Not how long has it been, not did you try X, Y, and Z already, but these interventions don't just have to be for people who are going to get stuck. If you are having really terrible flashbacks at night, you can go seek these interventions and they might take those flashbacks away forever. So the one that we use, I think the most effectively and least well known is EMDR. So EMDR, people don't know what that is, and we just should know what it is. And I understand from the science community, it took a while for us to kind of really be able to understand why it worked. And its inception, the way that it came about as a therapy is nuts. Like the woman who, Francine Rains, was like walking down the street and started to move her eyes in this weird way when she was distressed and noticed it made it feel, that is not real. There's not real scientific rigor in that inception, right? But EMDR essentially is bilateral stimulation to the brain while you are having a distressed thought. So it's like hey, what was that terrible thing that happened to you? Think about it. Imagine it. Let really deepen into it. And now I'm going to mess with the way that your brain is firing. And in my experience, what it feels like is I have this core memory that I could direct, Steven Spielberg and I could direct a movie and I could tell him everything about the movie. And when I'm done with the bilateral stimulation, which we use the optic nerve generally, you follow my fingers, I go from left to right while you're in the distress of the memory, and it moves the picture. It's like it rips it up into tiny piece of paper and it puts it across your brain. So it's still there, but it's diffuse. And the hope is with enough EMDR, it will stop being able to trigger the body. The message that the thoughts send down into the body are diffuse. And I'm not exaggerating when I say I have seen that particular technique. I have used that and had people never feel the same about the thing again. It can take 10, 15, but it is a treatment. So you see the difference? Like, yes. It's not just therapy the way they show it in the movies. It's like going to PT and then hooking you up to an electrode and sending signals to your knees so that it regenerates muscle. It's like that.
Right.
There's another. Go ahead. Sorry.
Is EMDR the same or different than tapping?
So great question. Let me say one thing about EMDR real quick is it's eye movement desensitization. I can't say that word. I'm reprocessing. You have to be certified to do it. Okay. So if you're looking for it, go look and make sure that you see that someone has been certified. I actually don't practice a ton of EMDR because there are people around here in town who it's their bread and butter. And it's almost simpler to sort of say like you would go for a massage, go here.
Right.
So you can use tappers. So for some people who can't follow your hand or a light bar, they often use a big long bar that has these ticks of light that go to the left and the right. You can use these little tappers that are like tiny little vibrators that you put in your hand. Also, someone might tap your knees or hit on or open your hands and tap them. Tapping, which is generally EFT, which is yeah. So that's a different technique where you are tapping on particular energetic pulse points on your body, like your temples and your eyebrow and your collarbone and your cheekbone. The root behind it is the same. The efficacy is not.
Gotcha.
So that for people who are anxious, I often see tapping in an airport. Tapping on your eyebrow, doing the routine of EFT, which is emotional freedom technique.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Because there's also another EFT, which is a couples therapy. Now I think I might get them wrong. Anyway, the tapping that we are talking about is really meant, again, to regulate the body and allow it to feel less anxious, which is a little different than the grief and loss trauma stuff.
Got it.
So EMDR is one treatment that I use, and most people that I know who use it in conjunction with a bunch of other stuff.
Okay.
So EMDR is an absolute immediate treatment. Then there's all these body-centered therapies. I'm trained in sensory motor psychotherapy, which is Pat Ogden's group, but Peter Levine is sensory motor experiencing. I think they would tell you they're very different. I think practitioners would tell you they're barely different. Pat and Peter used to know each other. And so I think they just branched out of the same idea. And that's what I was talking about in the beginning, which is we focus in on the traumatic experience, the memory itself, and we have you embody it. So let's pretend that you were mugged. We slowly, in a titrated way, keeping you within a window of tolerance that you don't have a panic attack. We bring you back into the moment. And then we invite your body to do something different. If you froze, we invite you to fight. And if you fled, we invite you to call the police. And it's a little hard to understand. I'm getting chills as I'm talking about it because it's so powerful. Obviously, you consciously know that you didn't fight your attacker. In real life, you froze. But when you embody the memory, right? When you're triggered into the memory, You're not triggered. When you are triggered into the memory, you get dysregulated. When you're brought into the memory in a safe way and invited to do something differently, it changes how you code the memory.
I see that totally.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the example that I use from my own trauma is the moment that I think that really is like the pinnacle. I knew that my mother had died because I felt it inside my body. And I felt this like water breaking sensation while I was in the car. And I called my husband and I said, I think my mom died. And he was like, no, I think she went to church. And I was like, she's in the house. I need you to find her. He called me back 8 minutes later and was like, you have to pull over. I pull over into this parking lot. He tells me that she died, which I already knew. And there are 4 kids in my car. My minivan is idling and I am doing all the things, which is my brain is misfiring. I'm having very crazy thinking because remember that the thinking is behind your forehead. Where you're being reactive is way at the base of your skull behind your neck. So that's like 100 miles in between, your reactivity and your thinking. So several people who I speak to on the phone are like, drop a pin, let me come pick you up. And I'm like, nope, I got to get these kids home. And really what I felt was this profound panic to be with my mother and pray over her body because I knew that would have been what she wanted. I know that's what she wanted. But I was a totally devastated daughter. And what I did in that moment was say, I'm going to be the mother who takes care of these children instead of the daughter who is destroyed. And I don't have any judgment about that. I just always wonder what it would have been like if I didn't do that. And in my EMDR treatment therapy, inpatient, my therapist said to me, what's the worst moment? What do you keep coming back to when you close your eyes? What do you see? And that's the moment I saw that and many pictures of my mother's dead body, but that one in particular, that moment in the parking lot. And so she said, okay, deepen into that. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What can you taste? All 5 senses. What do you feel? I got myself back into the parking lot in my body. And she did some tapping on my knees because I actually don't follow the hand very well. My eyes don't track that well. And then, really fast, probably because also I study this and I know what it's supposed to do. She said, is there anything that we can offer the you in that moment that would make this better? And my imagination just offered me my older brother and his wife pulling up in their car. His wife gets out, drives the minivan, and my older brother drives me to my mother's body where we are together when we go in. Carrie, that's not what happened.
I know. But
it's what feels like what happened.
And what I hear is that, when you have a death like this, you have no control over it. It's something that is just so beyond what you can control. But being able to go into that moment and choose something, because I think we all have regrets, this, that, and the other. I wish I could have done this. I wish I could have done that. But like to really be able to have someone guide you in that situation, even just talking about it really just kind of gives me a sense of peace. It's like, okay, well, first of all, I want to do all the things that you do because I just eat it up because I'm amazed by it. And I think the message that I'm getting very clearly from you is that a trauma can rewire your brain, but there are therapies and help available that can help to change that wiring. And that is like, are you kidding me?
Right. So what we're always talking to people about is like resilience. How are you so resilient? I'm so bored by the resiliency conversation. I don't care about resiliency at all. Why are we relying on, don't tell me about how you became the one extraordinary basketball player that makes $1 bazillion and has 9 cars. Talk to me about how playing basketball can help all kids feel good in their body and is a strength in life. So, to me, again, if we circle back, I do really believe, there's a Dr. Joshua Black, who's this lovely guy who was on my podcast a while ago, and he does grief dreams. A lot of people get resolution. I did. I had dreams about my parents. Where I said goodbye to them, even though I didn't get to say goodbye to them in real life. It didn't really happen, but I had one dream. I said goodbye to them. I haven't had another dream. Our minds and bodies are so wired towards healing. We are desperate for it. We just need it offered to us. Yeah. And so, I feel like colleges right now should be scrambling to have some mandatory weekend where everybody's taking a class on grief and loss. I mean, who do we think is going to be supporting the rest of the world in this untenable, aftershock of all the death? It's, we're up to like 8 million people nearly who are experiencing, some level of grief in a way that they weren't 2 years ago. That's a tsunami. So, to me, knowing that we are wired towards this healing and seeding the community with better education and more treatment providers. The treatments I'm talking about tend to be hard to find. I mean, I was a therapist for like 10 years before I even really knew what EMDR was. I think that's changing because everything sort of moves forward. More people have heard of it. It's not necessarily that much more accessible.
Right.
It's still expensive to train in. It's intensive to train in, and it's hard to find. Right. Certainly the sensory motor psychotherapy. I mean, it took me 5 years to train in that stuff. Wow. So, and then of course I feel like beholden when people have a story. I'm like, I know how to help you, but like I'm one practitioner. Imagine if the states right now gave some kind of tuition remission towards people who were working in, going to come out and work in grief and loss the way that they do when you're coming out and you're going to work in a public school. Or if states that have requirements, like you have to take an ethics class in DC because DC has a very high HIV rate. Here, we have to take a course on HIV so that people know how to actually follow all the regulations and the federal regulations regarding that. What if everybody just had to take a grief and loss course? I mean, even if it was a garbage course, it would be better than what's required, which is nothing. Yeah. There's nothing required in grief and loss. I became a therapist having taken no classes in grief and loss. I took a class on death, which was how does the body die, which was not nothing, right? But it was not on supporting people in grief and loss in any way.
Yes. And, I know that writing about your loss is not necessarily a substitute for therapy, but it can actually be very helpful. And, I remember I took your grief and writing course, which was just a big part of it's been a big part of my healing journey. But one of the things that you brought up was name a smell that you have associated with your loved one. And the immediate thought I had, and this is kind of, I don't know, it's not funny, but it's kind of weird, but I'm a mom and I love everything about my kids at this point before they become jerks, I loved my son Jackson's stinky feet.
Yeah.
And when I said that, I literally almost felt like I was going to throw up.
Yeah.
And it was such a profound feeling to me. And then you said, well, that's called a stug. So would you talk about a stug?
Yes. So stug is not my word, but I came across it in my research, and I think it's Teresa Rando. It's a sudden temporary upsurge of grief. So we use a word in trauma a lot, which is a trigger, which is super hard for people who have any sort of gun violence as part of their grief and loss story. But essentially so what works better is time travel. And I try to remember to use that word. I'm just so trained in the word trigger, but it's a 5 senses time travel. So, and when I ask people about it, I get lots of answers like yours, which is just a sensory experience, right? So something about my body is pulled into a moment where I am feeling an unbearable longing for the person that I lost, or the thing, or for what is lost to me. And smell happens to be the sense that is most associated with memory, and which, you know, makes sense because it is so distinct. Our ability to smell is so distinct. And when you were smelling Jackson's feet, you were actually also smelling his microbiome. People will tell you also that they like the way their wife smells when she sweats. You're actually, it's pheromones and microbiomes that you were drawn to in that moment because you recognize them as what you're bonded to. Animals do that. But a stug is essentially just this unexpected moment where you are brought into, you were just having a totally normal day. And then that Imagine Dragons song came on and now we're destroyed. Yes. And what's important about that word and why I think stug is important, because it's meant for those of us that are grieving and less about trauma, is that it's temporary. You're in it now. It's like you got wet by a sudden flash rainstorm. You can't just go to work dripping wet. Like, you're going to have to regulate your body, but it is there. Right. And you're going to be in the grief until you're not in the grief. And knowing what you know, because you've been seeking support and treatment, what are my things that help me when I'm in grief? Right. So writing helps people. There are other things like writing is, you know, we don't use that as a, this is going to cure you, but narrative therapy, knowing your story, being able to tell your story so it doesn't pull you under the water, walking yourself through the process. There's some connection between the brain and actually writing letters, but being able to write your story and write out how you're feeling is really important. Nobody needs to read it. I'm not saying write a memoir. I just mean literally use a pen and a piece of paper, which is more effective than using a computer. But there are also other ways, like people go running, they sing, they garden, they sew, I think you could probably do anything as an act of grieving. You would just need to have some consciousness that that's what you were doing. And when I say consciousness, I don't mean you're sewing and thinking about Jackson. I mean, you're saying, can I get this energy? How am I going to be with the energy? And sometimes grief work looks like just bearing with the day. Yeah. You know, what I say to people who are really in that strong, you know, they've been hit by a stug. They feel like they went backwards. They can't believe how bad they feel. And yesterday it felt okay. What I say is just do this. Just do this moment. Just do this day. You will never have to do it again. Because what I mean by that is, if you survive this moment without doing yourself more damage, the neuro pathway will know, the memory will seed the belief, I can survive this. Wow. Which is a lot of what grief work really is offering yourself possibilities in the novel thing that you're doing that your body and brain is telling you is impossible.
Wow. I have one last question.
Yes,
even
ma'am.
Though I could certainly talk for hours because we just could. But I love the psychology of it, but I could go on.
Yeah.
But my last question is, can you give someone just a basic, if you are having PTSD from a loss, what steps should they take?
Yeah, that's so great. What I would say is, I'm even going to take it backward, a little step backwards, which is if you don't know if you're having PTSD. So PTSD, if you use the Google, there's a 20 question questionnaire that you can go on, and look at, and it will tell you. I mean, when I went inpatient, I answered yes to 19.
Oh, wow.
That was the highest number I'd ever seen.
Wow.
And it's not asking you things like, are you going to kill yourself? It's not a scary questionnaire. It's asking you questions like, do you avoid trying to think about the thing? So it's giving you an idea of like, at what risk are you of having PTSD? And remember that PTSD means you are in the moment from your 5 senses, you're in it. So I think we think about it as something that a veteran has because veterans, they managed to not die on the war field, but then they came home and they started having what they, called sort of shell shock, which is they felt like they were on the battlefield. They went to sleep and they were having nightmares and they could smell burning bodies and all that stuff. So if you think about it that way, which is your body is giving you cues that you are suffering, and it's outside of, I didn't just smell something. I didn't just see something. And if you think about it as what it means is your body is just dysregulated, right? Like babies who sleep during the day and stay up all night. We talk to the pediatrician and they're like, oh yeah, their brain's messing up day and night. Here are some things to do. So the first thing that I would do is just go check on the questionnaire. If you're still not sure, even if you are sure, you can call a therapist. When it's PTSD, there are usually, when that diagnosis is what you're wondering, there are usually some like public clinic resources where people can at least go get an evaluation. Then what I would say is you can use the Google to read up, but what you're going to hear is you need some treatment. And if it were me, when it was me, I did EMDR first.
Okay.
EMDR immediately does that interruption.
Got it.
And then I did everything offered to me. Everything offered to me. I used music therapy. I exercised. I wrote. I sang. I did music. I did talk therapy. So my experience is people who treat PTSD often also have a secondary or tertiary thing that they like.
Got it.
One of the things that I did was a sound bath, which is where you totally overstimulate your system in the idea of regulating it with music. I did breath work, which is this way of sort of, you take very short breaths in order to activate the left side of your brain, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. I'm obsessed with breath work. So I don't believe that there's anything in the tertiary level that's perfect, but it's a little bit like having a flat tire. You don't want to keep filling up a tire that has a puncture. You need somebody to take a look at the tire. So if you think you have PTSD, if you're not sure, talk to somebody who does the treatment interventions. Those interventions are EMDR. People who have also been, we didn't talk about it today, IFS therapy, which is internal family systems. That also it works really well in a trauma model. And again, if someone walked through my door and let's say they had severe phobias, which I don't treat, I know the people who treat them. So even if they came in and they were in the wrong door, I'm going to help them get to the right door. Right. So that's what I would say. If you think you might have PTSD, if you went through a sudden loss, you deserve to not have to suffer.
Yeah. I know one of the things I think about a lot is, nobody would walk around with a broken arm.
No.
You would go to the doctor and they would take an x-ray and they would put a cast on it. So I don't know why over time we've made it that people think that we can't address our mental health. And I think the pandemic has really shown the light on it. And it's, it's hard because a lot of therapists are so busy that you can't get in.
It's true.
And so that's definitely a struggle. But, I just always like to remind people that there are resources out there. We don't have to do this alone. And just sometimes I cannot believe how I end every podcast has fit in every episode, because we're all just walking each other home. We are all trying to figure this out. And, when you realize you don't have to do it by yourself, that there are people who've been there, there are people who know how to help, it just makes you feel less alone, Yeah. And I just have been blessed just beyond measure with meeting you and just everything that I've watched you do and what I've learned from you. And I just can't say thank you enough. I just love watching what's happening. And I have so much respect for you. And, I love we just have mutual admiration for each other.
That's right.
And, together, I've said this before. I'm like, oh gosh, I don't think I can change the world, but it's like, no, we are changing the world.
You are. One person is the world. Every single day I get emails from people every single day that say something that I said helped them, or something that I directed them to was useful. I mean, if that is changing the world, because those people then are going to take those resources. I mean, maybe it's too much trickle down economics, but one of the things that I want to say to you, because it's the thing that like hits my heart every single time, is that this is impossible. Surviving the death of your child cannot be done. And yet it is. And yet you are. And you do not pretend it is anything other than a freaking street fight every single day. And that to me is the most important message that anyone could ever hear. Is it is as hard as you think it is. When you get in there and you're like, I will not survive this. Yes, accurate, 100% correct. And you will. You can't believe you will, because it is unbelievable to you, because no one has ever shown you or implied that this is a part of life. But you show us, you put it in your Instagram, you talk about it boldly, you show us pictures of what you were going through. And that to me is the best truth education that is out there. Is not to say, oh, this is what it was like back in the day, and now I'm all cured and better. Let me just open it up. And I also try to do that in my work. What I say is, this is what I think is right. Also, I don't do it. I'm constantly recommending meditation. I'm like, I didn't meditate yesterday. I'm saying, make sure to eat healthy. I didn't eat healthy. I'm saying, make sure to get lots of exercise. I still find exercise hard. Knowing the things is not the way that we are the mentor. It's talking about the things and telling the truth. And you are just a glorious, glorious mentor to all of us.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's ugly. It is ugly.
It's ugly.
But the one thing I can always say is that I will always keep showing up, and I will be tattered and torn. And some days I'm going to look worn out, because I am.
Not today. You look adorable today in your new outfit.
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, like I said, we could go on and on and on, but I'm just so thankful. This was as rich as I thought it would be. And
you're the loveliest. We'll just keep doing it. Call me. I'll always come on. I'm sure I'm due to have you back on mine. People should come on to my podcast and find your episode, because it continues to be one of the most listened to.
Aww.
On Grief Is My Side Hustle. It's so gorgeous.
Someday I'm going to come to your area, and we are going to have some iced coffee.
Oh, yes.
And we are going to do
that. Sounds perfect.
It's going to be great.
So much coffee.
Yes.
So much coffee.
Oh my gosh. We are going to be like annoying with so much caffeine, but I can't wait. Awesome, Meghan. Well, thank you so much. And thank you guys for joining us today.
Take care. Talk soon. Bye-bye.